You ruined my marriage. The words landed in the room with the force of a slammed door. Every conversation stopped. Every fork froze halfway to a plate. The soft music playing through the speakers suddenly felt distant, as if the entire house had decided to hold its breath. Evelyn Carter sat at the far end of the dining table beneath a row of warm hanging lights, her hands resting quietly in her lap. Across from her stood Sophia Carter, her eyes bright with emotion, her voice shaking just enough to sound convincing. The celebration had been meant to mark Daniel and Evelyn Carter's 30th wedding anniversary. Family members had traveled from 3 different states. The dining room was filled with framed photographs, laughter that had echoed only minutes earlier, and the smell of a dinner that nobody seemed interested in anymore. Now every eye was fixed on Evelyn. Sophia swallowed hard and looked around the room. Everyone deserves to know the truth, she said. Her words cut through the silence like a blade. Beside her, Ryan Carter slowly lowered his gaze. He looked exhausted, the kind of exhausted that came from months of arguments, sleepless nights, and questions with no answers. Several relatives exchanged worried glances. An aunt shook her head. A cousin folded his arms. Nobody interrupted. Nobody defended Evelyn. Sophia pointed toward her mother-in-law. If she had stayed out of our lives, none of this would have happened. A murmur spread around the table. Evelyn remained perfectly still. She didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice. She simply looked at Sophia with calm eyes that revealed nothing. The reaction confused some people. If she was innocent, why wasn't she fighting back? If the accusation was unfair, why wasn't she defending herself? Daniel Carter sat beside his wife. His face was unreadable. He stared at the table for a long moment before lifting his eyes toward Sophia. Yet he said nothing. His silence seemed to give weight to the accusation. Sophia took a slow breath and continued. She spoke about disagreements. About advice she never wanted. About decisions she claimed had been influenced from the beginning. With each sentence, the atmosphere grew heavier. Family members listened carefully, connecting memories, filling gaps, building a story inside their minds. A story where Evelyn had become the villain. At the far corner of the room, a grandfather clock ticked steadily. The sound felt unusually loud. Evelyn heard every second. She remembered birthday parties, holidays, school graduations. The countless moments she had spent trying to keep everyone together. Yet now she sat alone while years of assumptions settled over the room like dust. Ryan finally spoke. His voice was barely above a whisper. Maybe we should have addressed this a long time ago. The statement struck harder than any accusation. Evelyn looked at her son. For a brief moment, something flickered across her face. Not anger. Not resentment. Heartbreak. Then it vanished. Sophia nodded as though his words confirmed everything she had been saying. Around the table, people began shifting in their seats. Heads nodded. Conclusions formed. The verdict seemed to be writing itself. Daniel remained silent. His hands rested on the polished wood table. His wedding ring reflected the light overhead. He looked toward Evelyn once, then back at Sophia. Whatever he was thinking stayed hidden. Outside, the summer evening darkened beyond the windows. Inside, the anniversary celebration had transformed into something else entirely. A public judgment. A family trial without a judge. And at the center of it all sat Evelyn Carter, the woman everyone seemed ready to blame, while the one person who knew the full truth remained silent. No one reached for their food. Plates sat untouched beneath the warm glow of the dining room lights while the tension continued to spread through the house like a slow-moving storm. Sophia remained standing, her hands clasped tightly in front of her as if she were gathering strength from the attention now focused entirely on her. Around the table, relatives leaned forward. Some looked sympathetic. Others looked disappointed. Nearly all of them seemed convinced that they were finally hearing the explanation behind months of visible strain in Ryan and Sophia's marriage. Evelyn Carter remained seated in silence. The quiet around her felt different now. It was no longer the calm of a woman enjoying a family celebration. It was the silence of someone standing alone in a crowded room. Sophia glanced toward Ryan before continuing. Every major decision we tried to make somehow came back to her opinion, she said. Every time Ryan and I wanted to do something differently, there was pressure. Several heads nodded. Ryan lowered his eyes again. His shoulders seemed heavier than they had an hour earlier. Across the table, his cousin Megan folded her arms. I always thought there was too much involvement, she admitted. I just never wanted to say it. The statement opened a door. Suddenly others began adding their own observations. Small memories. Passing comments. Old assumptions. Each one sounded harmless by itself, but together they formed a narrative that painted Evelyn as a controlling presence behind the scenes. It was remarkable how quickly people could build certainty from fragments. Daniel listened to every word. His expression never changed. The room continued turning while he sat perfectly still. Sophia seemed encouraged by the growing support. I tried to be respectful, she said. I really did. But eventually it felt like there were 3 people in our marriage instead of 2. A few people exchanged uncomfortable looks. The accusation hung in the air. Ryan rubbed his forehead. He looked torn between loyalty, frustration, and exhaustion. Evelyn watched her son carefully. She could still remember the first time she held him in her arms at the hospital nearly 3 decades earlier. She remembered helping him with homework at the kitchen table. She remembered football games on cold Friday nights and college acceptance letters spread across the counter. Now he sat only a few feet away, yet he felt farther than ever. Still she said nothing. Her silence became increasingly difficult for people to understand. Most expected denial. Most expected tears. Most expected an argument. Instead, Evelyn simply listened. That choice unsettled some members of the family more than any defense could have. At the far end of the table, Ryan's younger sister Emily shifted in her seat. Something about the conversation seemed to bother her. She glanced between Sophia and Evelyn several times but kept her thoughts to herself. She was not ready to challenge the room. Not yet. Sophia continued describing moments that supported her version of events. She spoke confidently. She remembered dates. Conversations. Decisions. Her story flowed smoothly, and smooth stories were often the easiest to believe. The more she spoke, the more certain the room became. Outside, a gentle breeze moved through the trees beyond the large dining room windows. Inside, the atmosphere felt increasingly confined. Evelyn looked toward the framed family photographs displayed on a nearby shelf. Smiling faces. Holidays. Vacations. Milestones. A lifetime captured in images. It struck her how easily years of sacrifice could disappear beneath a few convincing accusations. Then Ryan finally lifted his head. Maybe Sophia is right, he said quietly. The words landed harder than anything else that evening. Several relatives nodded immediately. Sophia looked relieved. Evelyn blinked once and lowered her eyes. Across the table, Daniel's gaze settled on his son for a long moment. Something moved behind his expression for the first time that night. It was subtle. Almost invisible. But it was there. And for the first time since the accusations began, Daniel seemed less focused on what Sophia was saying and more focused on what she was not saying. The room no longer felt like a dining room. It felt like a courtroom where the verdict had already been written and the evidence was being gathered afterward. Sophia sensed the shift and leaned into it. Confidence settled into her voice. She no longer sounded like someone sharing her pain. She sounded like someone presenting a case. Do you remember the house discussion last spring? She asked, looking around the table. Several relatives nodded. Ryan and I were ready to move closer to my job. We had already toured properties. Then suddenly everything changed. Her eyes drifted toward Evelyn. Because she thought it was a bad idea. Another murmur moved through the room. Ryan sat motionless. The memory seemed familiar enough to support Sophia's claim. An uncle shook his head. I remember hearing about that. A cousin added, I always thought the move made sense. Piece by piece, the story grew larger. Sophia continued. She spoke about holidays, financial decisions, family gatherings, and future plans. Every example seemed to point in the same direction. Every road somehow led back to Evelyn. The pattern felt convincing. That was what made it dangerous. Most people did not question stories that connected neatly. They embraced them. Across the room, the grandfather clock continued its steady rhythm. Tick. 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 The sound blended with Sophia's voice until it felt like time itself was building a case against Evelyn Carter. Yet Evelyn remained silent. Her hands stayed folded. Her expression remained calm. The restraint puzzled even those who doubted her. Why was she not defending herself? Why was she allowing the accusations to stack higher and higher? Emily could not stop watching her mother. There was something unusual about Evelyn's silence. It was not the silence of surrender. It was the silence of someone carrying knowledge that could not yet be spoken. Emily could not explain why she felt that way. She only knew the feeling would not leave her. Sophia took a sip of water and continued. There were moments when I felt like my opinion did not matter at all. Every conversation eventually became about what Evelyn wanted. Several family members exchanged looks. The atmosphere had become so one-sided that no one noticed how little evidence was actually being offered. The accusations sounded substantial, but most were interpretations rather than facts. Daniel noticed. He noticed everything. He noticed which details Sophia repeated and which details she avoided. He noticed how Ryan's memories seemed uncertain while Sophia's seemed rehearsed. Most of all, he noticed that every example painted Evelyn as controlling while somehow removing Ryan and Sophia's own choices from the equation. It was a subtle imbalance, but once seen, it became difficult to ignore. Ryan finally spoke again. Things were not good for a long time. His voice carried exhaustion more than conviction. Sophia immediately nodded. Exactly. The speed of her agreement caused Daniel's eyes to narrow slightly. For the first time that evening, something felt off. Not wrong enough to expose. Not obvious enough to challenge. Just enough to linger. Across the table, Aunt Karen sighed. Families can be complicated. The statement seemed harmless, but it strengthened Sophia's position. The room wanted a simple explanation. Evelyn fit that role perfectly. She was present. She was silent. She was easy to blame. Outside, darkness settled fully over the neighborhood. Reflections filled the large windows, turning the family members into faint ghost-like figures staring back at themselves. Evelyn glanced at those reflections for a moment. It reminded her of something she once told Ryan when he was a teenager. People often see what they expect to see. They rarely stop to ask what they might be missing. The memory passed quickly. Sophia was still speaking. Still building. Still shaping the narrative. Then Daniel noticed something else. A date Sophia mentioned did not match his memory. It was a small detail. Almost insignificant. Most people would have missed it entirely. But Daniel remembered that week clearly. The realization settled quietly in his mind. He said nothing. Not yet. However, for the first time all evening, a crack appeared in the story that everyone else seemed eager to believe. The energy in the room began to change, though most people had not noticed it yet. The accusations were still hanging in the air, but they no longer felt as solid as they had 30 minutes earlier. Tiny inconsistencies had started appearing beneath the surface, like cracks in glass that only became visible when the light hit at the right angle. Sophia continued speaking with confidence. She described another disagreement from the previous year, another example of what she claimed was interference, Another moment that supposedly proved Evelyn had been controlling their marriage from the beginning. The story sounded convincing until Emily quietly frowned. She remembered that particular incident. Not perfectly, but enough to know something was wrong. Sophia had claimed that Evelyn pushed Ryan to reject a job opportunity in Denver. Yet Emily clearly remembered Ryan turning down the position because he did not want to relocate away from friends and family. She remembered the conversation happening in this very house. The memory lingered in her mind. Across the table, Daniel remembered it too. Neither of them spoke. Not yet. Sophia continued building her narrative. Every sentence seemed designed to lead people toward the same conclusion. Every example carried the same message. Evelyn was the problem. Evelyn was the obstacle. Evelyn was the reason everything had fallen apart. Yet the repetition itself was beginning to feel strange. Daniel sat quietly, listening more carefully than ever. He noticed that Sophia rarely mentioned her own decisions. She rarely mentioned Ryan's choices. Somehow every setback, every argument, every disappointment found its way back to Evelyn. It was a pattern that felt increasingly deliberate. Ryan looked emotionally drained. The evening had worn him down. Months of tension had already done most of the damage long before anyone sat at this table. Now he seemed caught between competing versions of reality. One version came from years of trust in his mother. The other came from the woman he had shared his life with. The conflict showed in his eyes. Evelyn noticed it immediately. A mother always noticed. Her heart ached for him, but she remained silent. That silence was becoming the most powerful thing in the room. People expected anger. They expected denial. They expected a dramatic defense. Instead, Evelyn sat calmly while accusation after accusation landed around her. The effect was unsettling. Some family members started questioning why a guilty person would remain so composed. Aunt Karen shifted in her chair. She had been nodding along for most of the evening, but now she seemed less certain. Sophia mentioned another story. Another date. Another conversation. Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly. There it was again. A detail that did not fit. Small. Almost invisible. But wrong. He remembered where he had been that week. He remembered because it had coincided with an important medical appointment for a close friend. The conversation Sophia described could not have happened the way she claimed. Daniel felt the realization settle deeper inside him. Across the table, Emily finally spoke. Her voice was gentle. Sophia, are you sure that happened when Ryan was considering Denver? The room immediately became still. It was the first question that challenged the narrative. Sophia blinked. Only for a moment. Of course I am, she replied. Emily nodded slowly but did not look convinced. I thought Ryan turned that job down before Grandma's birthday that year. Sophia hesitated. The pause lasted less than a second, but Daniel noticed it. So did Evelyn. Sophia quickly recovered. Maybe I mixed up the timing. The explanation sounded reasonable enough. Most people accepted it immediately. Yet something had changed. For the first time all evening, certainty had been interrupted. The story no longer felt untouchable. Emily lowered her eyes and said nothing more, but the question remained floating over the table. Daniel glanced toward Evelyn. She met his gaze briefly. Neither spoke. Neither needed to. Outside, the darkness pressed against the windows while inside the anniversary dinner continued drifting farther from celebration and closer to revelation. And although no one else realized it yet, the foundation beneath Sophia's story had started to shift. The question Emily asked should have been insignificant. A simple detail. A minor correction. Yet after it was spoken, the room never felt quite the same. Doubt had entered through a crack no one could fully close. Sophia smiled politely and continued talking, but the effortless rhythm she had enjoyed earlier was gone. Now every sentence seemed to require slightly more effort. Every example invited a second look. Every memory carried the possibility of being challenged. Ryan stared at the table. The longer the evening continued, the more exhausted he became. He wanted answers. He wanted certainty. Instead, he felt trapped between competing versions of the same story. Across from him sat the mother who had spent his entire life showing up whenever he needed her. Beside him stood the woman who claimed that same mother had quietly damaged their marriage from the beginning. The contradiction pulled at him from both directions. Sophia took a breath and delivered her strongest accusation yet. "She never wanted us to succeed," she said. The words landed heavily in the room. Several relatives looked toward Evelyn. Some appeared uncomfortable. Others seemed ready to believe it. Ryan slowly lifted his eyes toward his mother. For the first time all evening, he seemed to be searching her face for something. An explanation. A reaction. Anything. What he found instead was silence. Calm. Sadness. Nothing more. Then something unexpected happened. Evelyn blinked several times and lowered her gaze. Her composure remained intact, but the emotion behind it became impossible to miss. The room grew quiet. Even Sophia stopped speaking for a moment. The silence carried a different weight now. Not accusation. Not judgment. Pain. Memories moved through Evelyn's mind like photographs scattered across a table. She remembered the winter Ryan lost his first job and could not make rent. She quietly covered 3 months of payments without telling anyone. She remembered the summer Sophia's father underwent surgery and the young couple drove across state lines every weekend to help. During those months, Evelyn delivered groceries to their house, maintained their yard, and cared for their dog without asking for recognition. She remembered the countless evenings spent listening when either of them felt overwhelmed. The holidays she organized. The emergencies she handled. The burdens she carried so others could rest. None of those memories were spoken aloud. They remained inside her. Yet somehow they filled the room anyway. Emily noticed tears gathering in her mother's eyes. It startled her. Evelyn was not someone who cried easily. Neither was Daniel. The Carter family had always handled hardship quietly. Seeing that small crack in her mother's strength unsettled her more than any accusation had. Aunt Karen noticed it too. Her expression softened. A cousin, who had been nodding along earlier, now seemed uncertain. The atmosphere was changing again. Sophia sensed it immediately. She stepped forward. "Do not let this distract you," she said gently. "Being emotional does not change what happened." The statement brought the attention back to her, but something about it felt different now. Colder. More calculated. Daniel heard it. Emily heard it. Even Ryan appeared uncomfortable. Daniel finally leaned back in his chair and folded his hands. His eyes remained fixed on Sophia. He had been listening for nearly an hour. Watching. Comparing. Remembering. Every inconsistency. Every missing detail. Every moment that felt incomplete. The picture forming in his mind no longer matched the one being presented to the family. Sophia continued speaking, but Daniel was no longer focused on her words. He was focused on something else entirely. A memory. A conversation from 18 months earlier. A conversation he had never shared with anyone in the room. The realization settled over him with absolute clarity. He knew exactly when the truth had begun. He knew exactly where it was hidden. And for the first time that evening, he understood that if he remained silent any longer, the wrong person would carry a burden that was never hers to bear. The room had reached a point where silence felt louder than conversation. Every person seated around the table could sense it. Something was coming. The accusations had been spoken. The judgments had been made. Yet the evening refused to settle. It hung in a strange state of suspension, as though the truth itself was standing just outside the room waiting for permission to enter. Sophia looked around the table and seemed to recognize the shifting mood. The certainty she had enjoyed earlier was fading. Questions had appeared. Doubt had appeared. Even Ryan no longer looked completely convinced. Sophia straightened her shoulders. "I know this is difficult," she said. "But pretending nothing happened will not fix anything." Her words were directed at the family, but her eyes remained fixed on Evelyn. Evelyn did not respond. She simply sat quietly beside Daniel. The tears that had gathered in her eyes moments earlier were gone now. In their place was something else. Acceptance. Not acceptance of blame. Acceptance that some battles could not be won through argument. Across the table, Ryan exhaled slowly. He looked exhausted. His marriage was unraveling in front of his family. His mother was being blamed for it. His father remained silent. Nothing about the evening resembled the celebration they had planned. Then Daniel moved. It was a small movement. He pushed his chair back from the table and stood. The sound of the chair legs sliding across the hardwood floor seemed to echo through the room. Every conversation stopped instantly. Every eye turned toward him. Daniel Carter was not a man who interrupted people. He was not dramatic. He was not impulsive. When he chose to speak, people listened. Sophia watched him carefully. Ryan looked relieved and nervous at the same time. Emily sat forward in her chair. Evelyn remained still. Daniel looked around the room. His expression was calm, but there was a weight behind it that immediately changed the atmosphere. "Enough," he said quietly. The single word landed with more force than any speech could have. No one interrupted. No one moved. Daniel folded his hands in front of him and looked directly at Sophia. "I have listened to everything you have said tonight," he continued. "I have listened carefully." Sophia opened her mouth as if to respond, but Daniel gently raised a hand. Not aggressively. Not dismissively. Simply asking for a moment. She fell silent. Daniel turned toward Ryan. His voice softened. "Son, I know you have been carrying a great deal of pain." Ryan lowered his eyes. Daniel then looked at the rest of the family. "And I understand why many of you believed what you heard tonight." Several relatives exchanged uneasy glances. The room felt different now. The direction of the evening was changing. Slowly. Deliberately. Daniel's gaze returned to Sophia. "But there is a problem." The words settled heavily into the silence. Sophia's confidence appeared to waver for the first time. Only slightly. Barely noticeable. Yet it was there. Daniel continued. "Some of the things you described did not happen the way you said they did." No one spoke. Ryan looked up immediately. Emily stared at her father. Aunt Karen blinked in surprise. Sophia forced a smile. "What are you talking about?" she asked. Daniel did not answer right away. Instead, he glanced toward the hallway leading deeper into the house. A memory seemed to pass through his mind. A decision. One he had postponed for far too long. Then he looked back at the family. 18 months ago, he said slowly, "I learned something that changed the way I saw this entire situation." The room became perfectly still. Even the ticking grandfather clock seemed distant now. Sophia's expression tightened. Daniel noticed. So did Evelyn. For the first time all evening, Evelyn looked directly at her husband with genuine surprise. Whatever he was about to reveal was something even she did not fully know. Daniel nodded once, as if confirming a decision he had finally made. Then he turned and walked toward the hallway. Nobody stopped him. Nobody spoke. The entire family watched as he disappeared around the corner and headed toward his home office. And as the sound of his footsteps faded into the distance, a feeling settled over the room that no one could ignore. The evening was no longer about accusations. It was about to become about evidence. The minutes that followed felt longer than the entire evening that came before them. No one spoke. No one reached for a drink. The dining room remained frozen in anticipation while Daniel disappeared into the back of the house. Sophia sat down for the first time that night. Her posture remained composed, but the confidence that had carried her through the accusations seemed less certain now. Ryan watched the hallway with growing unease. Emily glanced between Sophia and Evelyn. The silence had changed sides. Earlier it had surrounded Evelyn. Now it surrounded Sophia. Then footsteps echoed through the hallway. Daniel returned carrying a small gray storage box. It was not large. It looked ordinary. Yet the moment family members saw it, the atmosphere tightened. Daniel placed the box on the dining table with careful precision. The sound seemed louder than it should have been. He rested one hand on top of it and looked around the room. "Everything in this box has been sitting in my office for 18 months, he said. Nobody interrupted. Daniel opened the lid. Inside were folders, printed emails, notes, and documents organized with remarkable care. Ryan stared at them in confusion. Evelyn looked equally surprised. Sophia's expression became impossible to read. Daniel removed the first folder and placed it in front of him. "I did not collect these things to embarrass anyone," he said calmly. "I collected them because I hoped they would never be needed." Ryan swallowed hard. "Dad, what is all this?" Daniel looked directly at his son. "The truth." The words settled heavily over the table. Daniel opened the folder. "Sophia told everyone tonight that your mother spent years trying to destroy your marriage." He paused. "What she did not mention is that your mother spent years trying to save it." Sophia immediately shook her head. "That is not true." Daniel did not react. Instead, he pulled out several printed emails. "These are messages your mother sent me when she became concerned about the tension between you two. Not once did she criticize either of you. Not once did she suggest separation. Every message says the same thing. She wanted reconciliation." Ryan stared at the pages. Daniel slid them across the table. The room grew quieter with every passing second. Daniel reached for another folder. "Then there is this." His voice remained steady. 18 months ago, Sophia asked me to keep a conversation confidential." Sophia's face immediately changed. A flicker of alarm appeared before she could hide it. Daniel noticed. So did Emily. Ryan slowly turned toward his wife. "What conversation?" Daniel opened the folder. Inside was a handwritten summary he had created immediately after that meeting. He had dated it. Signed it. Stored it. "You came to me because you were unhappy in the marriage," Daniel said, looking directly at Sophia. "You told me you were considering leaving long before any of the events you described tonight." Ryan blinked in disbelief. Sophia opened her mouth but no words came out. Daniel continued. "You said you felt disconnected. You said you were exploring a future that did not include this family. You asked me not to tell Ryan because you had not made a final decision." Ryan looked stunned. "You never told me that." Sophia lowered her eyes. The room felt smaller by the second. Daniel reached into the box again. "There is more." Nobody doubted him now. "Over the following months, your mother repeatedly encouraged patience, counseling, communication, and understanding. Every record I have supports that." He paused before adding the sentence that changed everything. "The person who spent the most time fighting for this marriage was the same person who has been blamed for destroying it tonight." The room fell completely silent. Not the silence of uncertainty. The silence that comes when a story begins to collapse under the weight of facts. Ryan stared at the documents in front of him. Emily covered her mouth. Aunt Karen looked away in embarrassment. Across the table, Evelyn sat motionless, her eyes fixed on Daniel. And for the first time all evening, nobody was looking at her as the villain. The change was immediate. Not dramatic. Not loud. Just undeniable. The room that had spent the evening judging Evelyn Carter now struggled to look at her at all. People who had nodded during the accusation suddenly found the table fascinating. Others stared at the documents Daniel had spread before them as if hoping the pages might somehow say something different. But they did not. The facts remained exactly where he had placed them. Ryan sat frozen. His eyes moved from one document to another. Email after email. Message after message. Every page seemed to tell the same story. His mother had not been working against his marriage. She had been trying to protect it. The realization settled over him like a weight he could not escape. Across the table, Sophia remained silent. For most of the evening she had controlled the conversation. Now she looked as though the conversation had moved beyond her reach. Daniel did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The evidence was speaking for him. I kept these records because I hoped one day they would help someone understand what was really happening, he said quietly. I never expected that day to be tonight. Ryan looked at his father. Why did you not tell me? The question carried heartbreak rather than anger. Daniel sighed. Because I believed people had to confront the truth in their own time. I hoped things would improve. I hoped the marriage would heal. Ryan lowered his head. The answer hurt because it sounded honest. Emily glanced toward her mother. Tears now rested openly in her eyes. Not dramatic tears. Not tears seeking sympathy. Just the quiet result of carrying blame she never deserved. Aunt Karen finally spoke. Her voice was barely above a whisper. Evelyn, I am sorry. The words seemed to unlock something in the room. Another relative apologized. Then another. One by one, people began confronting the reality of what they had done. They had accepted a story because it was simple. They had embraced a villain because every conflict seemed easier when someone could be blamed. Evelyn listened without interrupting. She did not demand explanations. She did not ask for apologies. She simply listened. Ryan finally looked at her. The pain in his eyes was impossible to miss. Mom, he said softly. The single word nearly broke him. He stopped speaking for several seconds. When he finally continued, his voice shook. I should have known better. Evelyn held his gaze. 1,000 memories seemed to pass silently between them. She remembered teaching him to ride a bicycle. Helping him through school. Sitting beside him during disappointments and successes. Loving him through every season of his life. None of that disappeared because of one terrible evening. Yet the hurt remained. Ryan wiped his eyes and looked down at the documents again. Every page seemed to remind him how easily he had doubted the person who had stood beside him all along. Across the table, Sophia remained motionless. The confidence that had filled the room earlier was gone. There was no argument left to make. No accusation left to repeat. The story she had built had collapsed under the weight of evidence and memory. Daniel closed the final folder and rested his hands on the table. The gesture felt symbolic. The case was over. The room knew it. Outside, the night remained still beyond the windows. Inside, the atmosphere had completely transformed. Earlier the family had gathered around a shared accusation. Now they gathered around a shared regret. And at the center of it all sat Evelyn Carter, not as the woman who had destroyed a marriage, but as the woman who had spent years trying to hold one together while quietly carrying blame that was never hers. For a long moment, no one moved. The dining room that had been filled with accusations now felt strangely peaceful, as though the truth had finally settled into its proper place. The stack of documents remained on the table, no longer as evidence to be debated but as a reminder of how easily assumptions could become convictions when nobody stopped to ask difficult questions. Ryan sat quietly, staring at his hands. The weight he carried looked different now. Earlier it had been confusion. Now it was understanding mixed with regret. He looked toward his mother again. This time there was no uncertainty in his eyes. Only gratitude and sorrow. Evelyn met his gaze and offered a small smile. It was not a smile of victory. It was the smile of a mother who had spent her entire life loving her child and had no intention of stopping because of one painful night. Daniel slowly closed the gray storage box and pushed it aside. The documents had done their work. Facts had replaced assumptions. The room no longer needed proof. It needed reflection. Aunt Karen reached across the table and gently touched Evelyn's hand. Others followed with quiet apologies and sincere expressions of remorse. No speech could erase what had happened. No apology could completely remove the hurt. Yet the willingness to admit mistakes mattered. It always did. Sophia remained silent. She understood that the evening had moved beyond her control long ago. The narrative she had built could not survive the truth that had emerged. Nobody attacked her. Nobody demanded explanations. The family seemed too exhausted for that. Instead, they sat with the uncomfortable reality that human beings often search for simple answers to complicated problems. Ryan finally stood and walked around the table. When he reached his mother, he paused for a moment before embracing her. The room fell silent again. Not because anyone was uncomfortable, but because some moments deserved silence. Evelyn closed her eyes briefly and returned the embrace. Years of memories seemed to gather in that single moment. Every scraped knee, every school project, every holiday morning, every difficult season they had survived together. Family bonds were not perfect. They were tested. They bent. Sometimes they nearly broke. Yet the strongest ones found ways to endure. When Ryan finally stepped back, his voice was quiet. "I am sorry, Mom." Evelyn nodded gently. "I know." There was no anger in her response. No desire to punish him for doubting her. Only understanding. The kind that comes from loving someone long enough to know they will make mistakes. Daniel watched them with relief. The burden he had carried for 18 months was finally gone. The truth was no longer hidden in a box inside his office. It belonged to everyone now. Outside, the first hints of midnight approached. The anniversary dinner had not unfolded the way anyone expected. Yet perhaps it had become something more important than a celebration. It had become a lesson. Evelyn slowly rose from her chair. Every eye in the room turned toward her. She looked around at her family, at the faces filled with reflection, regret, and understanding. Then she spoke the words that would stay with them long after the evening ended. When people are hurting, they often look for someone to blame. The easiest person to blame is usually the person who loves them enough to stay. The room remained silent. Nobody rushed to respond. Nobody needed to. The truth of the statement spoke for itself. Evelyn picked up her purse and glanced toward Daniel. He smiled. Together they began walking toward the hallway. Not as victims. Not as winners. Simply as two people who had chosen honesty over silence. Behind them, the family remained seated around the table, thinking about everything they had learned. And as the lights glowed softly over the room, one lesson lingered above all the others. The truth does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it arrives quietly, carrying nothing more than patience, evidence, and the courage to finally be seen.